All right, so let's resume, shall we? The last guy we talked about was Marx, and I just wanted to say a couple more things. Meredith raised the issue with all these criticisms of Marx. Uh, why is he so popular? And I do have an answer for that, and I think we mentioned it that it's the mythology of Marxism that's very powerful. And I think it's very rare, in my experience anyway, for people to actually analyze the arguments. I've never, like I say, in my life, never met a Marxist who could do that because every time I meet one, I'd say, well, can you sort out this difficulty for me? And they go, nah, nah. So anyway, that's that. But I want to say that the fact that the arguments
Honey,
do not necessarily follow doesn't mean you can't believe it. People believe in God. I mean, there's plenty of arguments that can't be confirmed with logic and any kind of epistemological proof that people believe. In fact, you couldn't get through your life if everything you did had to be justified by logic and empirical evidence. You couldn't, get through the day. So that's fine. I don't. The fact that it can't be empirically justified is not reason to believe that it's immoral or something like that. That's what I would say about that. Now, we are going to talk about Darwin today, and Darwin is not usually considered a philosopher, but I do, and I'm not unique in that. There are other philosophers that, uh, not that I'm a philosopher, but there are other like professors, legitimate guys, who consider Darwin an important uh, input to Western philosophical thought, and I definitely think he is. Um, so I would say. This is just a personal thing. My favorite works of fiction are the Odyssey, Don Quixote. When I say favorite, I mean books that stick to your ribs and make maybe a difference in your entire worldview. In fiction, that would be the Odyssey, Don Quixote, and Moby Dick. This is just personally. And then in philosophy, it would be Plato's Meno, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. But my favorite book of nonfiction is The Origin of Species, and it's just such a masterpiece. And what I'm going to do today uh, is do more quoting of Darwin's actual text than I normally do, and that's because it's just astonishing. It's an astonishing book to read, and his obsessive treatment of the evidence is very impressive. And remember, Darwin was I think I have a quote here. He was very nervous about publishing his book because
Of
it went and
course.
it was flying in the face of a thousand years of tradition and very, very firmly held beliefs. And he says here in a letter to botanist Joseph Hooker in 1844, he said, "I feel like I'm confessing a murder." And
Hmm.
after the publication, he wrote, "I am not the least afraid to die, but I am afraid to publish my theory." So he was quite aware that he was, risking, I don't know, social uh, ostracism or worse in publishing the book. And I don't think, considering the import of that book, I don't think that fear was unjustified. As it turned out, he didn't get drawn and quartered or burned at the stake. But what he was saying was very, very different on a lot of levels. Some of which are not that are not usually recognized. He Because he realized the weight of the tradition that he was contradicting or arguing or refuting, because he realized that the book is just an uh, obsessively detailed argument against creationism. He doesn't call it that. He calls it a single creation, which means that the world that we as we see it was created at one time, and that creation hasn't been interfered with by God since. That is kind of the Christian tradition. And because he knew the way to that, he his arguments are so detailed, and I think they're just unbelievable. And one of the reasons I like it is because I like arguments. Arguments are the soul of philosophy, and man, you can't get any better arguments than Darwin presents. Has anybody read The Origin of Species?
Yeah.
It's not like Neil has. It's not a normal thing to read, even among intellectuals, and it's too bad because it isn't. It's a bit dense, but it isn't that bad. It's nowhere near as bad as Kant or
No, no, I
Hegel.
didn't think so. But it
It's
was, as you
very,
said, very details, very, very, very methodically
I
when he
mean,
goes through. Yeah.
I find it
No,
very
yeah,
readable. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, I think so too. I was surprised at that, as a matter of fact.
the
So,
only
the the normal phrase to use with him is the survival of the fittest. That wasn't really his phrase. That is from Spencer, but he did use it. Um, and just to go back, just before Darwin went on his voyage on the Beagle, and that too, I don't know if you read that, but geez, Darwin, we think of these guys as old, doddering intellectuals. This guy, the voyage on the Beagle, first of all, and in that day and age, there's by no means a risk-free uh, thing to voyage out to into the oceans in the mid 19th century. That's not a risk-free adventure. And then to boot, I think it was when he got into Brazil, he wanted to go look at the plants and animals in the countryside. And in order to do that, since there was a war on, he had to hire armed guards to go with him and take him to the countryside. And who would do that? You got to be little more than a guy that sits in a lab and does experiments to be the kind of guy that would have balls enough to do that. Um, so uh, just before he left, Charles Lyell published Principles of Geology, containing the theory of uniformitarianism, which I have mentioned before for us. And the uniformitarianism in geology is uh, usually
Mhm.
opposed to catastrophism, which, in other words, instead of there being a series of great catastrophes like the flood, uh, Lyle proposed that things are always like they are now. They've always been that way. In other words, sand on the beach. If you look at how sand gets to be sand, it takes a very long time to grind up that much silica and into those little grains to create sand. And so Lyle reasoned that if it takes that long now, that's what it took to produce that beach. Therefore, the world is incomprehensibly old. It's not six. You can't do that in 6,000 years. And so the world is very, very old. And they didn't know how old. Of course, we do now, but they didn't know how old it was. And so Darwin and Lyell became friends, and Darwin was quite familiar with Lyell's book. And then he set out on the Beagle, as is famously known, and went to the Galapagos, and then didn't publish his theory for about 20 years. And he was finally, he hesitated, and he wanted to do more and more research. He was obsessive about getting enough research done, but he was tentative about it. And then Wallace, uh, you may have heard of the Wallace line, which is a line through Indonesia, on one side of the line we see a certain kind of uh, flora and fauna, and on the other side of the line we see another flora and fauna that's more associated with, say, Australia, and on the west side of the line it's more associated with Southeast Asia. That's called the Wallace line. Well, Wallace was a guy who was also investigating the theory of uh, a natural selection uh, or the survival of the fittest, and Darwin found out that Wallace was about to publish his, so he went ahead and published the On the Origin of Species. And the origin is what I've done is I don't know if a while back I sent out my summation of the origin of species to Meredith's group, and I don't know if any of you read that, but I'm going to kind of use that for today. And what I said there was that the book is it's an argument that in logic we call excuse me, the Latin name for it is er, modus tollens. I'm just looking at my notes here. If A, the form of the argument is A if true, if A is true, then B is true. We find that B is not true, therefore A is not true. This is the argument that was used by the Christians against Darwin and against the theory of evolution. Uh, you know, uh, the whoever design however the eye was designed, it had to be designed by somebody who was very intelligent. We find that it is um, designed by somebody who's intelligent, and that therefore it is God. If we assume the opposite, that they weren't intelligent, then the eye could never have come into existence. That's basically the argument against Darwin. Things that are really complicated take complicated planning. And so, since we don't see any evidence of that uh, in among the natural world, we have to assume God is the one that did it. And that is the form of the argument used against uh, evolution. And Darwin uses the same form against creationism. And I divided the argument into two halves. One is an attack on creationism, or the single creation is what he doesn't call creationism, and then defense of uh, evolution. Now, Darwin didn't know, he knew time was long, and his theory of evolution was incremental and slow. He thought, in given that much time, things can evolve that don't look like they can evolve because I'll get into why, but because of the pressures of um, the environment and predators, uh, they can in incrementally amount to something really impressive. All right, so um, here's Darwin talking about he doesn't pull any punches. He's unsparing. And once he decides to do this, he's not going to pull punches. He's unsparing in his contempt for theorists who hold that a single act of creation explains the existence of the variety of plants and animals we see. Here's his quote. Do creationists believe that at each supposed act of creation, one individual or many were produced? Were all the infinitely numerous kinds of animals and plants created as eggs or as seed or as full grown? And in the case of mammals, were they created bearing the false marks of nourishment from the mother's womb? Although naturalists very properly demand a full explanation of every difficulty from those who believe in the mutability of species, on their own side, they ignore the whole subject of the first appearance of species in what they consider reverent silence. I mean, I love that stuff. Um, and he asked, why should similar bones have been created in the formation of the wing and the leg of the bat, used as they are for such totally different purposes? Um, if if species were created as unique, we would expect them to be fixed entities, but this is not all at all what experience revealed, and this has been clear to human beings since the dawn of farming or before. Um, he points out that humans have interacted with species in a way that led to their alteration. Did somebody have something to say? Uh, so humans have interfered in farming and in animal husbandry, culling the lame animals or the lame plants and just sticking with the ones that were healthiest. We've done this not with any knowledge of evolution, but just that's what we thought would work best. Nobody thought they were doing anything, but over a period of time, uh, it the species became refined in a way that suited us, not in a way that suited nature. And Darwin goes, well, all we're doing is affecting them with the environment that they're seeing. In other words, say, we're giving them rewards, the animals, we're giving them rewards if they do something we like. Uh, but this actually leads to a change in the species, or we're taking the strongest plants and planting them. And so that affects the uh, which plants survive and which don't. And Darwin asked himself, well, doesn't nature also stress out animals and plants? So aren't we do why would we have this effect if nature itself couldn't have this effect? Say if the temperature went up or down, or uh, the the area became more desert-like, or whatever. Those are also stresses on the animal. Why couldn't nature have the same effect that we're having? He asks himself. And so he says, let us look to the familiar case of the several breeds of dogs. It cannot be doubted that young pointers, here he's talking about how instincts, as well as the shape of plants or animals, are affected by environmental or reward and punishment. Anyway, it cannot be doubted that young pointers will sometimes point and even back other dogs the very first time they are taken out. Retrieving is certainly in some degree inherited by retrievers and a tendency to run around instead of at a flock of sheep by shepherd dogs. These actions performed without experience by the young and in nearly the same manner by each individual are performed with eager delight by each breed and without the end being known. For the young pointer can no more know that he points to aid his master than the white butterfly knows why she lays her eggs on the leaf of the cabbage. These behaviors are not seen in the wild. They have been bred into the dogs through artificial selection. And so he says there's no obvious reason why the principles which have acted so efficiently under domestication should not have acted under nature. uh, Another thing he notices that both in domestication and in the wild, we can see offspring that possess an attribute of an ancestor rather than their direct parents. Um, so it is that with regard to horses and zebras, stripes may appear that an ancient common ancestor possess. Then he talks about the idea of things being more evolved than other animals being more evolved or less evolved. And he has this just amazing description of barnacles, which he knew a lot about. I had no idea about this. But this is what he says about barnacles. The Latin name is Cirripedes. The larvae in the first stage have three pairs of legs, a very simple single eye, and a proboscis-formed mouth, with which they feed largely, for they increase much in size. In the second stage, answering to the chrysalis stage of butterflies, they have six pairs of beautifully constructed natatory legs, in other words, swimming legs, a pair of magnificent compound eyes, and extremely complex antennae. But they have a closed and imperfect mouth and cannot feed. In the second stage, they cannot feed. Their function at this stage is to search by their well-developed organs of sense and to reach by their active powers of swimming uh, a proper place on which to become attached and to undergo their final metamorphosis. When this is completed, this is the third stage, they're fixed for life. Their legs are now converted into prehensile organs. They again obtain a well-constructed mouth, but they have no antennae, and their two eyes are now reconverted into a minute, single, and very simple eye spot. In this last and complete state, cirripedes may be considered as either more highly or more lowly organized they were and than they were in the larval condition. So the point he's trying to make is you can't just look at a fossil and see whether they're more advanced or less advanced than their predecessor, because we here have a living animal that goes through three stages, and any one of them could look more advanced than the other, depending on what the environment was. Does that make sense? What he's saying? Yeah, it's kind of. I mean, who knew that about barnacles? Uh, excuse me. Okay, another point he makes. Now, this is all under the heading of arguing against the idea of a single uh, creation. That's what he's uh, doing now. He's attacking that idea. So, another point he makes, besides this, is the mutability of the species. He thinks that just what I've been saying, that species wouldn't change throughout time if they were created perfectly in the first place. But we see they do change throughout time, even with our intervention. Okay, another issue that contradicts the idea that um, there was one single creation. Why is it the fact that hybrids can mate and sometimes continue to evolve into a new species? And we know this also from farming. People would have known this at an early stage of human development. And it's not true. Darwin makes the point. It's not true. And I'm not sure. I learned that species couldn't mate with outside of their species. This turns out not to be the case. And Darwin knew this. So I don't know. Is that what you learned in school? That a species is defined by not being able to mate with if they can't mate with each other, they're separate species. But
Yes,
but
I think
Darwin,
Yes.
it's true of mules, the horse and the donkey. They are sterile. But I eventually learned that there are some hybrids that are not sterile.
that's right.
And it may be rare, but it does happen.
And Darwin knew this, and he also knew that that could lead to a new species. All right, so that doesn't seem like consistent with the idea there was a single creation. Um, and then another one that I just love is that atrophied organs that appear to be artifacts of previous periods, when they were useful, for example, wings in flightless birds and insects, and eyes in blind mole rats. Why would a wise designer waste energy producing useless appendages? And I have here's a quote from Darwin. I presume that the bastard wings in birds may be safely considered as a digit in a rudimentary state. In very many snakes, one lobe of the lungs is rudimentary. In other snakes, there are rudiments of the pelvis and hind limbs. Some of the cases of rudimentary organs are extremely curious. For instance, the presence of teeth in fetal whales, which, when grown up, have not a tooth in their heads, and the presence of teeth which never cut through the gums in the upper jaws of our unborn calves. It has even been stated on good authority that rudiments of teeth can be detected in the beaks of certain embryonic birds. Nothing can be plainer than that wings are formed for flight, yet how many insects do we see where wings are so reduced in size as to be utterly incapable of flight, and not rarely lying under wing cases firmly soldered together? And what my comment was is it's as though you were to buy a new car and under the hood you find a neatly installed small boiler for a engine no longer connected to anything. And there's tons of examples of this in nature. And Darwin's going, well, now okay, if you got a really wise creator, how come he's so wise that he puts irrelevant organs and appendages in animals that never use them? How does that make sense? It seems like a perfectly good question to me. Um, and we also see other animals that have features that, like wings, would be more suitable for another way of life. This is really funny too. How strange it is that a bird under the form of a woodpecker should have been created to prey on insects on the ground. That upland geese, which never or rarely swim, should have been created with webbed feet. That a thrush should have been created to dive and feed on subaquatic insects. That a petrel should have been created with habits and structure fitting it for the life of an auk or grebe, and so on in endless other cases. But on the view of each species constantly trying to increase in number with natural selection, always ready to adapt the slowly varying descendants of each to any unoccupied or ill-occupied place in nature, these facts cease to be strange or perhaps might even have been anticipated. And then Darwin also, he says he calls himself bewildered that there's evil in nature. And I think I mentioned this before with Aquinas's fifth proof for the existence of God, which is the fifth way or the one from a purpose. And if you see animals that are behaving in terrible ways, and you're looking at that for evidence of a creator, well, the evidence they're giving you is of a creator who is amoral and will achieve his ends at the expense, kind of vicious expense of other animals. And so his passage with that is, with respect to the theological view of the question, this is always painful to me, and I'm bewildered. I had no intention to write aesthetically or atheistically. I'm sure you wanted to be aesthetic, but I own that I cannot see as plainly as others do, and as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us. There seems to be too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the parasitoid wasps with the expressed intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. And this one I didn't know about. It may be difficult, but we ought to admire the savage, instinctive hatred of the queen bee, which urges her to instantly destroy the young queens, her daughters, as soon as born, or to perish herself in the combat. For undoubtedly, this is for the good of the community, and maternal love or maternal hatred, though the latter is fortunately most rare, is all the same to the inexorable principle of natural selection. That's a pretty powerful passage, I think.
Mhm.
That that you know, the queen bee will kill its daughters. And why how is this consistent with a beneficent God for one thing? And why did it have to be? And he says, well, natural selection doesn't care if it's moral or aesthetically pleasing or nice or not. It doesn't care. It's all just a numbers game, which we'll get back to in a minute. Those are the main criticisms uh, of a single creation that Darwin offers. And then the second part of his argument regards the defense against their criticisms of natural selection. Did somebody want to say something? Okay. So one of the common criticisms of natural selection is the temporal discontinuity of the geological record. You can't say specifically with your pathetic science how this came to be so obviously it was caused by God. Darwin did not have DNA. Instead, he uses conjecture and insight based on an astonishing breadth of knowledge of living things. Okay, I look at the natural geological, this is Darwin. I look at the natural geological record as history of the world imperfectly kept and written in a changing dialect. Of this history, we possess the last volume alone, relating only to two or three countries. Of this volume, only here and there is a short chapter has been preserved, and each page there are only a few lines. each word of the slowly changing language in which history is supposed to be written being more or less different in the interpreted succession of chapters and may represent the apparently abruptly changing forms of life entombed in our consecutive but widely separated formations. Well, that's a little wordy, but the idea is that we just have such small samples of the fossil record, and this is well recognized by uh, people who study fossils. That, and then we have things like the great unconformity. If you don't know about that, I mean, it looks as though there's something like 1 billion years of the fossil record just erased, and so we go from one period and then all of a sudden to 1 billion years later, and that's called the great unconformity. Well, um, where are all the intermediate stages? Well, they're lost to the great unconformity. There's no fossil record of any of them. So Darwin sees as a geological necessity that, yes, of course, the record is incomplete. Um, and he says evolution is constantly working on all parts of the anatomy, not just those preserved in fossils. Many birds have special enhancements to the cellular structure of their eyes, for example. Millions of developments of this sort have unquestionably occurred in the history of life, and none are available for study because they're not fossilized. That's what he answers for the temporal discontinuity of the geological record. And now, even more clever is the geographical discontinuity of the geological record. Um, First of all, an obvious answer to this is, in other words, why is this animal here and and it's also here, but they're separated by an ocean? How could that be? You know that this is well known by Wegener, who discovered that the geology and the flora and fauna on both sides of the Atlantic in Africa and in South America, east coast of South America, west coast of Africa, were related. How could they be related if they're separated by an ocean? And this is a an argument of creationism against the idea that they could have evolved together. How could they evolve together? The continents uh, weren't in touch with one another, so that couldn't have happened. So Darwin, yeah, first of all, he says uh, there have been periods of glaciation where there may have been like the corridor for human um, migration from Asia to the New World. That's something that could have come and gone during the history of the world. So that's the first excuse he uses for that. That some previous passages have disappeared and are no longer with us. But the this is where he just gets insane. The possibilities of transport. This is just so nuts. He's concerned about how plants or animals could have shown up in different places where they're separated from the other species by thousands of miles or whatever. Okay, as to plants, he says, I could show that the carcasses of birds, when floating on the sea, sometimes escape being immediately devoured, and seeds of many kind in the crops of floating birds long retain their vitality. Peas and vetches, for example, are killed by even a few days' immersion in seawater, but some taken out of the crop of a pigeon which had floated on artificial salt water for 30 days, to my surprise, nearly all germinated. I mean, this is nuts. This is an experiment he did. You know, he has a pigeon with a crop of seeds, and he just has it floating in a saltwater pool for 30 days. He pulls the crop apart and plants the seeds, and the plants sprout. This is nut stuff. I mean, it's nutty experiments. Okay, in February, he says he took 3 tablespoonfuls of mud from 3 different points beneath water on the edge of a little pond. This mud, when dry, weighed only 6 3/4 ounces. I kept it covered up in my study for 6 months. pulling up and counting each plant as it grew. The plants were of many kinds and were altogether 537 in number, and yet the mud was all contained in a breakfast cup. So he's just saying there's this profusion of life coming from what seemed to be just a cup of mud that had nothing in it. And how that could get transported, well, he's going to talk about that in a minute here. Um, uh, the idea is the seeds are amazingly able to survive. Um, okay, now shellfish is another one. And this is a good one because they say, how can shellfish go from, say, one river or lake to another or ocean if there's no water connection between them? So here's his experiment on that. He says, um, another agency is perhaps more effectual. There was a truncated passage there. I suspended a duck's feet, which might excuse me. I suspended a duck's feet. I guess he cut off the duck's feet, which might represent those of a bird sleeping in a natural pond in an aquarium. Okay, he suspended these duck's feet in an aquarium where many ova of freshwater shells were hatching. Okay, so freshwater shells were hatching. And I found that numbers of the extremely minute and just hatched shells crawled onto the feet and clung to them so firmly that when taken out of the water, they could not be jarred off. Though at somewhat more advanced stage, they would voluntarily drop off. These just hatched mollusks, though aquatic in their nature, survived on the duck's feet in damp air from 12 to 20 hours. And in this length of time, a duck or heron might fly at least 600 or 700 miles and would be sure to alight on a pool or rivulet if blown across the sea to an oceanic island or other distant point. Again, the this experiment, I mean, you just imagine him doing this experiment. He's got duck legs suspended in an aquarium where he knows that uh, these little eggs of shellfish are swimming around and they attach themselves to the the duck's legs, and then he sees how long they'll survive. And they survived for like 12 to 24 hours. And he says, in that time, the ducks could have flown to a completely different river or lake, and therefore the hatching could occur there. So I mean, I just imagine this guy in his lab. What a crazy scientist doing these weird experiments, and his knowledge of these animals is just so encyclopedic. Okay, so um, I have a just a final passage that I love from Darwin that's in the Origin. So let me just read this. It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up that all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress, the long lapse of ages, and then so imperfect is our view into the long past of geologic ages that we only see that the forms of life are now different from what they formerly were. In other words, that's all we get from the fossil record. All of a sudden they're different. But we can't see that I just love that every hour uh, evolution is scrutinizing the success of every animal and every cell on the planet and eliminating those which don't work. Now, the end result is that, uh, in my view, it's nearly impossible, or maybe completely impossible, to conceive of what evolution is doing, which is why I'm kind of sympathetic to people that believe in mythology or believe God in God. I've said that AI doesn't care, robots don't care about dying. It's a really intensely alien concept to have something not care about dying. But evolution doesn't care about any individual dying at all, or even a species or an entire family. But as to life itself, evolution cares about nothing else than survival. It doesn't care who dies. It doesn't care whether the things that die are beautiful or ugly. It doesn't care whether the things that die are smart or noble. All of these things, and this goes back to the idea of nominalism, if you may remember it from both Hobbes and the medievals, are completely anthropocentric. Evolution makes no distinctions and has no preference between Einstein, Marilyn Monroe, or a centipede. Uh, and that is just so hard to conceive of, that there's this force that's so indifferent to any kind of quality that we value. And so this is entirely against not only Christianity, but the idea of Aristotle that evolution is proceeding for a purpose. Evolution always proceeds backwards. It only proceeds by elimination. It only cares about numbers. Did this survive? It doesn't matter if it's better or worse in general. Was it surviving then? If not, it dies and it's never seen again. So if human beings, uh, let's say there was a catastrophe and the only people that survived the catastrophe were say dwarfs that lived in some kind of housing, and let's say they were mentally handicapped dwarves, and they were living in some kind of housing that somehow escaped this catastrophe. That would be the survival of the fittest. They would be the representatives of the human race going forward. So the idea that evolution, it's really hard to shake the idea that, which is anthropocentric, that we are the crown of creation because we have brains and we can talk and all those things. Um, it's really hard to disabuse yourself of that feeling. It's just so alien, that evolution is so cold and it's just absolutely by the numbers, that's why I say I sympathize with people who just can't get next to that idea. Um, and then the main final point I want to make is we've been going through, if you want to call it, moments in the dialectic from the beginning of this class. Uh, the Hegelian moments of the dialectic, if you want to start out with the immediate stage, if you uh, consider animals an immediate stage, because animals have no language, they don't have any symbolic language like we do. They can't separate themselves and say, hey, Gerald or Alan or this guy, and he cannot even be there, but we know who we're talking about. Animals don't have anything like that. They don't have a symbolistic or a symbol oriented uh, system of communication that allows them to distance themselves. So the first thing that happens is the invention of language. That was the first separation from the immediate, to use Hegel's terminology. And then I would say the next separation is when we tried to create mythology that described where we were and how we were, and described it instead of just taking it for granted. We described uh, this is how things came to be. Remember, these were called etiological myths. And then the next stage of the dialectic would have been the pre-Socratics saying, no, we don't need those myths. We're going to rely on nothing but reason and observation. And then the I I'm just going to kind of discount for the time being Plato and the Christians and go to Hobbes. The next thing is that we ourselves are just uh, propelled by physical needs. We're not propelled forward by spiritual desires, but physical desires. And then um, next we have the idea that uh, Kant says that even our mind is not representing the outside world. And then we get to Darwin, and this is kind of that it's going to be what I'm going to call the next to last signpost in the end of innocence of human awareness. Darwin says that we're all our meat computers. All of that is just the result of some random bunch of numbers uh, being jiggled throughout billions of years to come up with who we are right now. It doesn't matter to evolution that we can talk and have brains and can discuss our Hegel. It doesn't matter at all. Nothing is important about that. If we were to unleash some kind of nuclear catastrophe and kill all the human beings on the planet, evolution wouldn't care that much. It wouldn't be any worse than iceball Earth. They would the things that survive would just pick up, and that would be evolution. And so, like I said, I consider this the last second to last signpost of the road to the end of innocence for human beings. And that is that for today. Thoughts? Yeah, Peter.
Um, I completely agree with evolution of species by means of natural selection. I agree with the survival of the fittest as go, go. I agree with the survival of the fittest as long as fittest is not understood as morally best or noblest. Um, I think there's a problem that, as I understand it, doesn't affect Darwin so much as it affects the sociobiologists and the neo-Darwinians like Richard Dawkins. And that's something like this. What is the material that natural selection works on? Clearly, there are random variations. Clearly, Darwin didn't know about the genes and genetic mutations accomplish a lot. But it seems to me that there's room for something like what you might call not creationism, but creative evolution, in the sense that an organism develops an eye because at some level, which I don't understand, and I'm not sure anyone understands, it wants to see. It develops organs of motion because at some level or other it wants to move. That's part of why what it's doing. And, the thing it wants above everything else is to keep on living and have surviving offspring. I agree with that too. But where does it come from?
Well,
I just think, well, just let me finish. I
yeah,
just think
sorry.
there's a tendency to make it too much a matter of mechanism. I think Darwin himself really suspended judgment on this, and the
I
little
don't
I've
think
read
so.
by him, I think, is wonderful to read, and he was a great naturalist. But I think there's a tendency now to say, we know the mechanism, it's only a mechanism. It has nothing to do with the organism's desire or purpose or intent. And I think the most egregious example of that comes from Richard Dawkins's book, The Selfish Gene, back in 1976. He's tried to distance himself from this, but I don't know that he's succeeded. We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed by the selfish molecules known as genes, which in a strange way attributes purpose and intention to the genes, but not to the organism.
Well,
And it seems to me,
I think
at some level, the organism is using the genes.
I think I'd have to. I think if I understand you, I'd have to disagree because evolution never has a desire to do anything,
I'm not saying
except
evolution does. I'm saying the organism must.
even the organism has that desire, but whether or not it has certain equipment that it's like we have brains and we can talk. The only
Yeah.
reason we have that is by accident. We stumbled upon this by accident, and this is
Yeah.
Darwin. Now, Stephen Jay Gould is slightly different about this, but not really. Evolution never has a plan. You accidentally find something that's an advantage, and it only has to be like something like 1% advantage for it to become universal within the
Hmm.
species after a period of time. And if more people, it's just numbers. If more people survive with that attribute, or more bugs, or more
Yeah.
snails, then it's kept. And if not, it isn't kept. So there's only one desire, and that is survival.
Right, but that desire might lead an organism to develop eyes, feet,
No,
legs,
it
and so
just
on.
it
I'm
doesn't
not
lead
saying
it.
evolution does it. I'm saying the organism itself wants something. And it doesn't seem to me that I'm arguing with Darwin, but with certain much more mechanistic applications of what Darwin says.
No, I think Darwin is totally mechanistic. I'd have to disagree with you about that.
Uh,
There is no desire on any individual to do anything except survive. And as a result, if he accidentally survives in more numbers than his neighbors who don't have the same quality,
yeah.
then he perseveres.
Well,
But
that
you're
may be true,
Peter,
but
Peter, you're saying then that the organism can imagine what would help it survive, and I don't think
no, I wouldn't go
that's
that
not
far.
Darwinian at all. I mean, you don't know what it is about your survival that you
I
know.
wouldn't go that far. All I would say is that the randomness, though it accounts for a lot, particularly if you have billions of years to work with, doesn't seem to me to account for everything, such as what is the material on which the random um, laws of natural selection operate.
But there's not
I
a
mean, a religious person would say God created it, but you don't have to say God created it. You could only say what I think Darwin does tacitly admit. I don't know where it comes from. The
What do you
problem,
mean by
I
the
think,
material, Peter? What do you mean by the material?
the organism itself. I mean, how does the origin of life cannot be accounted for by evolution or by anything else. God is strictly a deus ex machina if you say, well, God created life. But if you don't accept that deus ex machina, you have to say, we don't know where it came from. We don't know how it developed from non-living chemicals. That
Yeah,
is
but
at
that's a
some
different
level, I
step.
think maybe the whole universe really is alive, which does not mean that natural selection doesn't operate, doesn't mean it operates in a purposeful way. It only means that there is something there that it has to operate on that Darwin didn't think he could explain, but Richard Dawkins and Edward O. Wilson and so on do seem to think they could explain, but I don't think they can. You know,
Well,
if
I'm not sure what it is you think they can't explain, but
I'm not a naturalist, I'm not a biologist, I don't know enough about it.
I
Um,
would say that anything that posits, like Doug said, a forward-looking gene is contrary to what Darwin says. The
well, I
gene
wouldn't say
doesn't know
forward looking.
because the environment can change. So it's not like even if there was a forward-looking gene, it wouldn't make any difference because
No,
tomorrow there could be a an asteroid.
I'm not saying forward looking. Take Spinoza's idea of the conatus, the trying to be what it is of any organism, or as far as I understand it, Spinoza thinks a stone also has a sort of conatus or effort to continue being what it is. I don't think, human beings can look to the future not very effectively. Barnacles can't. I could completely agree with that.
Well, I don't think
I think
any
in trying to be
microbes can't.
a barnacle, becomes something through natural selection and random variation and so on, but it still is somehow trying to be, if all it wants to do is survive, it still wants to survive as itself. whatever that means. I mean, there's a mystical aspect to what I'm saying, but I don't think it really is at variance with what we know and what we don't know about the facts of nature.
Um, okay, just one other thing. I doubt if I agree with you on this, Peter, but I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. So
I
let's
don't
just.
know either. I'm not sure.
I do want to say one thing though, that there is a modern variation to Darwin by Stephen Jay Gould, which is Darwin imagined there being an infinite amount of variation going on all the time, very slowly, that eventually sifted out what worked and what didn't. And there's no like effort going forward. But what this isn't that important, but Stephen Jay Gould is his theory is called punctuated equilibrium. And this is was suggested by something you said, Peter. All critters will stay the same unless they're challenged by some kind of change in like either the predators or the environment or something like that. And there are animals on the earth, I think alligators and horseshoe crabs, and I know there's a couple others that have not really changed for millions of years. And
Mm,
that's because they have suited their niche just fine and they haven't needed to. So in other words, there hasn't been any challenge to their current design that would diminish their numbers relative to somebody who had a slightly different design. I think
yeah,
that's what I would how I would put it. So he's a little different,
right.
just a little different from Darwin. He doesn't dispute him. He just says things can stay the same forever, and I think Darwin imagined them slowly evolving.
Yeah, and the Burgess
I
shale.
think bottlenecks are. I think one of the keys to evolution are bottlenecks.
Mhm.
You know, and if you manage to get through the bottleneck, there's something about that organism that allowed it to get through it. You know,
Right.
Um,
And
and God, who knows what the bottleneck could be? It could be anything. Environmental thing, whatever. It could be anything.
and then,
So
of course, Darwin allowed for sexual selection as well.
yeah.
Gould's book, The Burgess Shale, is a really fascinating account of how, bottlenecks occur and an awful lot of things don't make it past the bottleneck. And in most cases, we won't even know what they were. And, as you were saying, Tony.
Um, so I want to just close this off by, or not close it off, but at least end what I wanted to get across today with one idea, and that is what throws a monkey wrench or a very big puzzle into this whole program that Darwin has described is not so much, I don't think, what Peter says, although I'm not sure I understand it, but the Meno. So, how do we account for the fact that these meat computers who assemble themselves out of sludge and slime 500 million, a billion years ago, these
Yeah.
meat computers have been developed? And I think Laurel had an answer for this, but I'm not sure I buy it. Um, how do these meat computers somehow find in their minds the solutions to mathematical problems which are uh, not part of their daily experience? How does that happen? And so that's Plato's Meno, and I certainly haven't figured that one out yet. But it seems like a very weird fact, and it's a fact that is difficult to explain with just mechanistic I'm not saying there's a mystical thing like Plato thought that, you know, we'd had a former life or something. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying it's a puzzle that I don't think, well, I said, if you don't think it's a puzzle, go read the Wikipedia article on the philosophy of mathematics,
Yeah.
because nobody now has a firm answer on how that is possible. So that's what I have for you today. Barring any further comments, I don't want to cut off the discussion. I just said those are all the points I wanted to make.
I had I'm making this totally making this up, but relative to Peter's comments, I was thinking if you had a thought, sort of a thought project here, and you could change something about your future, about the evolution of your particular species or family, and you knew there was a bottleneck ahead of you, what would you choose to change? But you don't know what the bottleneck is.
Yeah.
You know, could you choose something that you would be changing about your,
Well, it
you know,
leads to survivalism, doesn't it? And
you couldn't
there's a
pick, you
certain
couldn't pick
logic to survivalism, but we don't know what's going to survive. It
exactly.
could be that our knowledge of math that seems to have no connection with anything could help us survive, and our guns would not help us survive. There's no telling really.
I mean, I don't know, you just don't know what the bottleneck is ahead of you.
Yeah. Well, there's an awful lot of accidents. I agree completely with Darwin about that and about natural selection and artificial selection.
So, Alan, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, it occurred to me, Tony, that um, I think you were trying to interpret what Peter was saying as a clarification of evolution and Darwin's theory, and you were saying no, that's not what Darwin was saying. But I think that Peter's offering something different, is actually
Mhm.
disagreeing with Darwin, and I think that I want to agree with Peter, and I think that one point that I want to make is that Darwin's theory only explains changes in life once life arises, but as far as I know, does not grapple with the question, why is there life at all?
Um,
Um, and I'm curious about whether there is a sort of a tendency within the universe to produce life if the situation in respect to temperature and existence of liquid water and things like that make it available. Uh, my guess is that life would occur pretty much anywhere in the universe where those conditions existed. And I want to know why, when it seems to oppose the whole idea of entropy and simplicity. It creates complexity unnecessarily where you would anyway, that's one issue. I think another issue is that once consciousness exists, human beings can begin to control or at least intentionally impact evolution. I mean, we can try to preserve species, we can eliminate species, we can create new species and we've got individual and groups of human beings who are thinking about how to manipulate their own DNA and the DNA of their children to uh, further certain characteristics or eliminate other characteristics, kind of a modern version of eugenics that that I, it indicates it's not just mechanical process of survival. It can be a planned process of survival.
Um, if I could respond to both of those things, first of all, I wasn't disagreeing with Peter's point because I'm not sure I quite understand it, but I was disagreeing that I don't think that's what Darwin says. I don't think Darwin says that
I think we
it's
all agree with that. It's
anything
not
but
what Darwin's.
mechanicals. That's all I would say. And then
Yeah.
with regard to the second thing, we nobody knows how life started, but with regard to human beings manipulating things, animals have always had effect on other animals and plants to see, and there's plenty of evidence for that. But the idea that we know enough that just like all the rest of the animals in the world, we don't know enough to know what's going to be successful even 10 years from now, much less a million years from now. So I would be, I mean, people will do it. If we can mess with other people's genetics, we'll do it because anything we can do, we will do. However, I mean, it's kind of the ultimate act of hubris to think you understand enough about evolution and nature to make the right decisions in that regard.
I think I was reading an article recently where someone noted that given the age of the Earth, what is it, 6 billion years or something, that we could have had several very advanced civilizations, evolutionary civilization productions of civilizations equally as advanced as ours, or maybe even more advanced, that died out, disappeared, and we would never know about it. So we may be the sixth cycle of advanced evolution on this planet.
Well, there'd have to be, that's the kind of thing that is a very cool idea, but we have zero evidence for anything like that.
Well, that's what the point was. There's no way to know, there's no way to know that other than just to speculate about it, given the 6 billion years of the existence of the planet.
How could such a complex thing happen? And we have no fossils, no evidence, no artifacts, and we're already going back and looking at rocks billions of years ago. I mean, it's not like all evidence is going to vanish. It seems like a very fun but very
I
speculative
don't
idea.
know. I just sort of think about it.
Tony, I'm sorry, but
Ann,
we
yeah.
have to say goodbye now.
Oh, you're going to say goodbye.
There's other
Okay,
stuff
Ann.
happening,
We'll see
yeah.
you on Thursday, hopefully.
We will. Bye bye. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Yep.
Bye, Ann.
Bye, Ann.
Okay. So that was a big one, and forgive me for introducing Darwin, who I know is not usually in the philosophy textbooks, but I think the import of what he does to the Western consciousness, our understanding of what we are, where we are, and what we're doing, is to my way of thinking, unavoidable. You have to consider Darwin because it's a mechanical view of the universe, something like, or parts of the universe, something like Hobbes and something like Marx, but
Yep.
it's from a different, completely different choir. And so there we go with Darwin. Next time we will start on the existentialists, I think. So I think we'll go with Nietzsche and then Marx, and then, excuse me, Nietzsche and then Kierkegaard, and then finally probably to Wittgenstein if there's enough desire for that.
You're not going to do one
Yeah.
on Freud. You're not going to do a.
Freud, I could do Freud. Maybe I'll mention Freud a little bit. Freud is kind of like, I would say I'd put him in the category with Hobbes and Marx and for the reason that he's somebody you want to know about that people become too attached to, like almost to a religious point. Just like they do with Marx. This is reality. Marx is the class struggle is the primary reality, or Hobbes, selfishness is the primary reality, and with Freud, it's your experiences as an infant or a very young child that form the structure of the rest of your life and your decisions. I think all those are worth considering, but the tendency is for people to believe in them, to believe it's the be all and end all. I have a good friend that is like that. I keep telling her, never mind. But anyway, maybe we'll talk about Freud a little bit. Freud was influenced by Nietzsche, so maybe we'll get to it through that door. And like that.
All right.
Anything else?
So
Yeah, yeah.
I wanted to note that I'm wearing my Galapagos shirt today,
Oh,
which
cool.
fit right in.
Very good.
And I'm assuming this new invitation will also work on Thursday. Are you going to send a
Yes,
new invite?
God, hopefully that was a nightmare. It was all because I was stupid enough to put an endpoint. I didn't think we'd go this long, and so I put an endpoint, and then going back and having to redo the whole thing basically is what I had to do and set it up. This is my own, operator error. I didn't know enough about what I was doing, but hopefully this will be the same now. That new link should be the same and should get you in next Thursday.
Well, this is an evolutionary, we're it was a well, right. It's no different. We run into a bottleneck and we adjust. So anyway, all right. Well, this was great. Fantastic.
I just want to,
Tony, a side question. I had to drop out for a few minutes, but when listening to all of the stuff that Darwin did, his field work, his experiments are incredible. But he must have had a library that was impossible to put down. I mean, figuratively, impossible to put together in that time, because he sounds like he must have had contact to every piece of information floating around.
It really is incredible, the stuff he knows, and a lot of it is his own experimentation, his own research.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's quite an amazing guy. Alan, did you have something else or no?
well, I just, on a non-philosophical topic, I wanted to make a plug for the latest episode of South Park. I think
Oh,
it's a new height of satire and free speech.
wow. It's such a train wreck that's going on right now. It's hard to get your mind around it, which is why we study specific arguments and we don't bother with the big picture of the outside, the icky outside world. Uh, all right, anything else? All right, guys, lovely to see you as always, and we will see you on Thursday.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thanks, Tony.